Welcome to an Alliance for Justice Advocacy Short. This brief presentation discusses the definition of direct lobbying. To access Alliance for Justice's extensive resources designed to support your organization's lobbying and election activity, register for one of our regularly scheduled live or web-based workshops, order or download our plain language publications, or forward a question to our on-call attorney by visiting us on the web at www.afj.org. For those organizations that choose to measure their lobbying under the 501h expenditure test, there are two types of lobbying that they must track and report to the IRS. Today, we will limit our discussion to direct lobbying. There are three components to the definition of direct lobbying. There must be a communication with a legislator expressing a view about specific legislation. You must have all three components for the communication to count as direct lobbying. Because some of these components are not as intuitive as they sound, we're going to parse out each one of them individually. So how do you communicate? You communicate in a variety of ways: phone calls, emails, meetings, letters, but there are also some creative ways to communicate that are a bit outside the box of traditional communications. For example, years ago, AARP sent cakes to every member of Congress representing the Medicare bill which was being considered, and they removed a section of the cake to represent the fact that the Medicare bill did not include a prescription drug plan. This was a very tasty communication with legislators about the Medicare bill, which no doubt made the legislative staff that received it, and likely AARP staff members who got to eat the missing piece, all very happy. It is an example of a delicious direct lobbying communication. Another creative example, with less calories, was created by the Union of Concerned Scientists. They had their staff send their gas receipts to Congress when it was considering raising fuel efficiency standards for cars. Again, this is an example of a communication with a legislator expressing a view about the bill to increase fuel efficiency standards. Now that we have a better understanding of communication, let's talk about what is meant by the term legislator. Of course, legislator includes all of your representatives at the federal, state, and local level. It also includes their staff. You do not get a free pass if you're talking to your legislator's staff. The IRS treats this communication as if you were speaking directly to the legislator. But the term legislator goes much further than just your representatives. The definition of legislator includes some people you would not commonly think of as legislators. For example, what power does the president, your governor, or your local mayor have even though they are in the executive branch of government? If your organization is communicating with the president, your governor, or your local mayor, and you're asking him or her to either veto legislation passed by the legislature or to sign a bill into law, for purposes of that communication, the president, governor, or mayor are a legislator, and that communication counts as direct lobbying. We're not quite done with the definition of legislator. The definition of legislator does not include members of special purpose boards. While these boards differ from location to location, examples of these boards include school boards, planning commissions, zoning commissions, and water districts, among others. These boards may make policy recommendations to a city council, for example, but they do not have any legislative authority to themselves make law. Thus, they are not legislators. These special purpose boards are generally executive in nature and have no legislative authority. Communicating with these types of special purpose boards would not count as direct lobbying. One final definition of legislator, for those of you fortunate or unfortunate enough to live in a direct democracy-driven state, for the purposes of ballot measures, which include ballot initiatives, referenda, constitutional amendments, and bond measures, the legislature is the general public. Since ballot measures are voted on by the general public is your legislature. You can communicate with the general public and either support or oppose a ballot measure, or define the impact of a ballot measure. For purposes of that communication, it is direct lobbying. Often we think that when a ballot measure is involved, that is electoral activity. However, the IRS treats ballot measures as lobbying. More importantly, it treats communications to the general public about a ballot measure as direct lobbying, not grassroots lobbying. While we commonly think of grassroots lobbying when we are communicating with the general public, for purposes of ballot measures, the general public is the legislature. Now that we're clear on what is meant by communicating with a legislator, how do we define specific legislation? Remember, you need all three components of the definition of direct lobbying for a communication to count as direct lobbying. Specific legislation includes all bills that are introduced, but the IRS does not stop there. The IRS also defines specific legislation to include bills that are not yet introduced. In fact, there may be absolutely nothing on paper. We commonly define this category of specific legislation as identifying a problem and presenting a specific solution to the problem that can only be accomplished through legislative action. So, For example, let's presume New York State just passed legislation that puts the legal drinking age at 25. Your organization is in Wisconsin, and it works to promote legislation that addresses the high death rate of minors involved in drunk driving accidents. If your organization sends a letter to your legislator and asks him or her to adopt the same legislation passed in New York State, even though there is no bill introduced in Wisconsin, your organization has referred to and reflected a view on a specific legislative proposal. Thus, the communication is direct lobbying. There are some categories of activity, however, that do not meet the definition of specific legislation. For example, regulations. Regulations are not specific legislation. If a bill passes the legislature and it is signed into law, it typically goes to an administrative agency that is responsible for writing the regulations that interpret the law. Providing comments on how the regulations should be structured is not specific legislation and is therefore not direct lobbying. Enforcing laws is not specific legislation. Communicating with a legislator and asking that he or she help enforce the drunk driving laws in your community is not a direct lobbying communication. The law has already been passed, and all you are asking is that it be enforced. Executive orders are not specific legislation. Executive orders are issued by the President or head of the executive branch of government. Executive orders typically direct executive operations. Asking the President, your governor, or perhaps your local mayor to pass an executive order on an issue is not specific legislation because they are acting within their executive power, not any legislative authority. Litigation is not specific legislation. Signing on to an amicus brief or litigating the constitutionality of a new law is not specific legislation. These are just some examples of activity that does not meet the definition of specific legislation and therefore is not direct lobbying. We hope this information on the definition of direct lobbying is helpful to you. For more detailed information on the rules governing nonprofit advocacy, please go to our website at www.afj.org, read our publications Being a Player and Worry-Free Lobbying for Nonprofits, or contact our on-call attorney for technical assistance. Please contact us if we may be of further assistance to you. Thank you for listening to our advocacy short.